Welcome to Gateway to the university, gateway to Drexel, to the range of collections at Drexel University, which represents material from across the world, from the natural sciences to the fine and applied arts. It is a pleasure to collect in this staggering building by the celebrated American architect Frank Furness, who built it in 1876 as the Centennial National Bank, and it's now part of Drexel University's campus. It's Paul Peck Alumni Center, and within it is a newly renovated gallery in which this material has been brought together. Of course, part of the pleasure of being at Drexel is being part of an urban university in which one is deeply embedded in the city. But when one looks at a gown like this, one's taken into another world. So this is by James Galanos, who was a Philadelphian designer who moved to LA and dressed celebrities like Marilyn Monroe and Diana Ross. And what was quite wonderful is that his entire costume archive was actually given to Drexel University, and it forms part of the very rich Robert and Penny Fox historic costume collection. This gown is so different to so many other things in the collection because we have here an example of contemporary design, and that's one of the things for which the Westphal College of Media Arts and Design, within which the Fox collection is embedded, is really famous for. So in this case, we have three objects: a coral, a mastodon jaw, and a piece of silver, English silver, from the 18th century. Two pieces below are from the Academy of Natural Sciences at Drexel, and the epern, the centerpiece above, is from the founding collection at Drexel. And in fact, that piece of silver belonged to Drexel's founder himself, Anthony Drexel, and his wife Ellen. And each of the little dishes around it are engraved with their family crest and Ellen's initials. You might be able to see that it looks rather Chinese, and that's because it belongs to a form of art known as chinoiserie, which were things made in Europe in Chinese style, or what was thought to be Chinese style, or objects made in China for Europeans. And the design of this rather grand epern is based on drawings, architectural representations of what were deemed to be Chinese buildings. There's a famous pagoda in Kew Gardens, which was built just before this piece was made by William Chambers, who was an architect who published on Chinese buildings. And there was a man called William Halfpenny, who published new designs for Chinese temples, in which you can see little roofs and hanging bells, which are very similar to this epern. Below the mastodon was something like an elephant and populated North and Central America, died out about 10,000 years ago, but it was very elephant-like. And this bone in particular, this jawbone, was collected for Thomas Jefferson. He displayed it at the White House and his house in Virginia, Monticello. One of the pleasures of bringing this material together is thinking about how it relates together, how one can articulate interdisciplinary connections between material within the various Drexel collections. So in this case, and with the fabric behind me, we're looking at fabric design, at ceramic design, and natural history, botanical books, and seeing the connection through the work of William Morris, the great 19th century leader of the arts and crafts movement. And it's rather interesting for us today, when we're in this show, looking at the William Morris textile of honeysuckle and remembering that it was made in 1876, which is the year of this building. So Morris was looking at a variety of sources for these extraordinary designs, and this fabric was one of the first objects to come into the Drexel Museum, a collection of textiles from Morris, because Drexel was very much focused in the late 19th century on the relationship between industry, science, and art, and it's a theme which has continued up to the present. How do you relate the arts, the various forces within the industrial world and the sciences, and see the connections between them? He was looking at Islamic ceramics and the designs on Islamic ceramics, which were in turn inspired by the designs on Chinese ceramics. And so we have these fantastic objects. One is a Turkish dish made by Iznik potters, and Assyrian tile, actually also made by Iznik potters. Iznik was a town in North Turkey, but the potters who made the Syrian tile had actually emigrated to Damascus. And then below that is a botanical book. It's a herbal, which was published first in the late 16th century, about in the time of Shakespeare, by John Gerard. And after Gerard died, it was revised, and the edition that we have here is from the late 1630s. When one looks at the page in John Gerard's herbal, one sees that Morris really was drawing on these 17th century, late 16th, 17th century designs and producing something for the late 19th century. It's also about indigo, and indigo was the principal dye to generate the blue in the textile behind. We find indigo in Gerard's herbal, and we also have a specimen of indigo here. Both of these, the specimen of the book from the Academy of Natural Sciences. And it allows us to think about the impact of economics on art, that art is not something that just exists in a bubble on its own, that political, social, economic, gender, class factors play into the production of art. And so when we think about the really dire circumstances under which the farmers in Bengal were producing this indigo for consumption in London, we realise there's so much work we can do also within the university to bring people in the history department together within the design collections, and to work with students in thinking about how you use material culture collections to engender research and also to engage the community and the public. In these two cases, we're looking at something really rather interesting, focusing on Europe, but reaching out to the rest of the world. Europe in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries and early 20th centuries was engaged in campaigns across the world, imperial, colonial, but scientific as well, which wrapped in to the other adventures, as it were. Hard to distinguish them. One has a great deal of material to think about here. This case has two extraordinary books. The book of shells was produced under the patronage of the King of Denmark by Regenfuss. The text is in French and German, and it's one of the great books of shells ever produced. And because the Academy of Natural Sciences at Drexel has millions of shells in its collection, it was able to find the shells which are represented in Regenfuss's book and lend them to the show so that we could lay them out in just the same order, so that visitors can see the actual shells and the shells so richly illustrated in Regenfuss's book. The book above by Renard, produced in Amsterdam, looks a little like the Yellow Submarine, if I may say, because the hand-coloured illustrations are almost psychedelic in their richness. But amazingly, even despite those elaborations, which Renard put into his book, scientists were able to identify something like 90% of the species which he illustrated. And these books and the material related to them reminds us very much that the Academy of Natural Sciences at Drexel has one of the great libraries of natural history in the world, a library of 250,000 books, which includes so many fantastic volumes like these. Back to this shelf, we have a piece of porcelain and a kale, which is a bowl and cover and saucer from the Meissen porcelain factory, patronized by Augustus the Strong, which was the first factory to copy Chinese porcelain successfully. And the designs are very much in the Chinese style, chinoiserie, rather like the silver épingle that Antony and Ellen Drexel owned. And alongside a small silver coffee pot from the founding collection at Drexel, and it was made by a London silversmith a little earlier than Thomas Pitt's épingle. So in this case, which sits underneath a selection of works on paper from the Drexel collections, are two pieces from the Legacy Centre within the College of Medicine, one of them very moving indeed. The Legacy Centre is the principal repository of the history of women in medicine and also of homeopathy. The pillow sham is just a charming object embroidered by the graduating class of the Women's College of Medicine in 1896, and it includes objects, embroidered objects, which are associated with their work: a skeleton, a bicycle, 2 hearts with the names Birdie and Snooks in them, just showing the close relationship that women formed, and in the college. It was a male-dominated profession, and remained so for decades and decades and decades. But this is filled with the names of the graduating students, reflecting their close relationships, and it's a powerful reminder that history can actually be physically manifest in very rich and evocative ways. The letter by Eliza Greer is powerful in a completely different way. Eliza Greer graduated the following year from the women who embroidered the pillow sham and from the Women's College of Medicine, and she was an African-American woman who then practiced in South Carolina, and she was undergoing real health issues herself, and she wrote to Susan Anthony, the champion of women's suffrage, to see if she could obtain some help. And this is the letter that she wrote to Susan Anthony. Susan Anthony wrote to the College of Medicine saying that she was very much engaged in important work and hoped that they could help, but she couldn't at the time. This is a reminder again that so many of these objects at Drexel and archives at Drexel are a manifestation of history, but some of them, like the pillow sham, are more than just history. And here are 2 of the several paintings in the exhibition that come from the founding collection. These 2 landscapes, the Moran American and Charles-François d'Aubigny French. Moran was one of the American Hudson School painters, Hudson River School painters, the Sublime School in America. And it was painted just after Moran, his brother, had gone to London to study the work of the great English landscape artist Turner. And it shows not the Hudson River Valley, but actually the Wissahickon Valley in Philadelphia. And it's called Ripening of the Leaf. It's an autumn scene with cattle grazing in the background. In this painting by Charles-François d'Aubigny from the founding collection at Drexel, takes us to the beginning, but is also in its own way really interesting. It's interesting because d'Aubigny had a studio boat that he went out on the lakes and rivers around Paris to paint the changing light of the day, the reflection on the water, and that was quite a novel idea. He wasn't the first person in history to do this. In fact, the great 14th century painter Ni Zan had a boat studio in South China. However, d'Aubigny did it, and you can see actually figures out on the river here. And he inspired not only us, but he inspired much earlier on at the same time Claude Monet, his younger contemporary, who was one of the leaders of the Impressionist movement, to acquire his own boat studio, which Monet did just the same year that this was painted. So it's a reminder that this sort of painting was the beginning of the collections at Drexel. These late 19th century paintings were acquired by the founders of Drexel to give the new university an art collection, inspire students to paint, but to design particularly. It takes us back to thinking about the relationship of industry, art and design. And yet, over the last more than 125 years, Drexel has really expanded its collections so that we now, as we've seen, have extraordinary examples from the natural science world. 18 million specimen collection at the Academy of Natural Sciences, including their wonderful library, to a medical collection, to a sound archive, to a costume collection, the university archive. It's a very, very rich holding, and I'd like to invite you to come and see this very small but very rich selection of that material.